Thank you very much, Rangan. There's only one thing I wanted to pick you up on, which was when you said that you've been practicing for many years. Because I checked you out, and I have been doing this stuff since before you were born. Mind you, I've been complete rubbish for most of that time. And one of the reasons for that is clinical isolation. So the thing that's changed that is community. Firstly, a community of doctors who are like-minded and understanding this sort of thing. And now the bigger community that we're discussing and being part of here today. So thank God for these guys and what they're doing. And the second thing, where's my thing? The second thing that's made a difference to me is the science that has advanced so much in the last decade, 2 decades, maybe. And one of my heroes, if you like, in this is Ed Kane, who I have to thank Mike Ash, wherever he's gone, for introducing me to. Ed was an engineer. He's not a doctor, so he brings an engineer's understanding to the structure and function of cells, and particularly of their membranes. And so what we're talking about now is fats. If you strip down to Olympic athlete physique, you're still going to be 20% lipids by weight, and that includes the weight of your bones. So for somebody like Jessica Ennis, who's about 9 stone, that's 25 pounds of lipids. And for somebody like me, it's about 40 pounds. And that's not this stuff here, the storage fat, is the stuff that's in your cells and actually making the structure of your cells. Lipids just means fats and oils. Fats being solid at room temperature, and oils being liquid, which is useful for cooking, but doesn't really help in the science, so we lump them all together as being lipids. And pretty much all of these lipids are in the membrane of the cells, in the structure, the outer wall of the cell, and 10 times as much as that in the internal structure. So there's the lower image is the outer wall, and there you go, and all the internal structures within it as well. The nucleus that contains most of the DNA, the mitochondria that produce energy within cells, and so they're all made of lipids, and lipids are in this particular structure, the phospholipid bilayer. So it's like, kind of like parallel trees. It's like a forest or 2 forests back to back. You know these Scandi Noir things they have on the TV. They have these credits where the top half is a mirror image of the bottom half, or vice versa. Well, it's kind of exactly like that. And those molecules are all pretty much the one on the right here. The point about them is that the top half there, the top part, is water soluble. It's hydrophilic. The bottom half isn't. It's fat soluble. Well, in fact, it's fats. So obviously it's not water soluble. And what happens if you put these sort of molecules of oil and water together is that they spontaneously form into this sort of bilayer. So this is something happening in the self-assembly of a bilayer of lipids. Will only happen in the presence of water, but in that case it'll happen, in this case, in about 200 nanoseconds, which means I think that it can happen 5 million times a second, which is pretty darn fast. And we know this will even happen in the near vacuum. It'll happen in space. And so it's perfectly possible that life came down from comets or whatever. And the composition of these layers is critical, is very important, because you have just the saturated fats. They're all parallel structures like that. They packed together much more densely, and if you have unsaturated fats in, they have the double bonds make them wider, so they're not so dense, they're more fluid, and the composition is critical. It breaks down pretty much like this. So your cell membranes are pretty much 1/3 the unsaturated fats, so that's the omega-6s, the omega-3s, and so forth, that we hear so much about. But 1/3 is saturated fats, which we're all practically deprived of these days. I don't know about where you guys are staying, but if you go to a hotel and come down to breakfast, think, oh, I'll have a yogurt or whatever, you pick it up, it's going to be 0 fat, or very low saturated fats. We've all been deprived of it for 50 years, really, and 1/3 is cholesterol. So how can these things be so bad for health? And cholesterol, of course, is also the starter molecule for every single hormone in the body, the estrogen, the testosterone, even the thyroid molecules and so forth. They all come from that. So what went wrong? Well, I used to think it was Doris Day that sang this. If I knew you were coming, I'd have baked a cake. But actually it was this lady, Eileen Barton, so I blame her. This to #1 in 1950, pretty surprising. But if you go 1,000 miles in any direction, they don't say, oh, I knew you were coming, I'd have baked a cake. They say, if I'd known you were coming, I'd have killed a lamb or a seal, or killed the fatted calf when the prodigal son returns. We talk about living off the fat of the land, not the sugar of the land. Now, there's a lady called Johanna Budwig. Enjoy this image because it's the last one you're going to get of anybody other than an old white male. And I apologize for that, but that's just the way it is. Johanna Budwig was a German scientist who figured out a fair amount about lipids and how important they are and so forth back in the 1950s. And yeah, the diet is still used widely. Then in the same decade, the guy called Richard McCandless effectively invented food allergy for the UK market, and the Americans here won't know about that, but he did. I read this book back in the 1970s, and it certainly changed what I did. But more or less 20 years before that, he wrote a book called Eat Fat and Grow Slim. So the understanding was there right back then. We knew, well, some people understood it, but then it all went off course. Never mind that. It went off course in large part due to this guy, Anderson Keys. Anderson Keys invented the K rations that American soldiers got in World War II. And a large part of that was donated by the Hershey Corporation, sweet makers. So I think that was kind of formative for him. And he developed the hypothesis that heart mortality is strongly associated with total intake of fat, and coronary disease correlated with serum cholesterol as well. And there were two key experiments that he did, the Minnesota coronary experiment and the 7 countries study, which I believe is still ongoing, the latter. However, last year, a team in the States went and got the raw data from the Minnesota coronary experiment, which had claimed to show that lowering cholesterol improves your risk of heart disease. And this is what this paper actually showed. So if you lower your cholesterol from 5.4, which is above the normal upper limit of 5 in this country, in Britain, down to 4.6, you will actually increase your risk of death by 35% within the period of that study, which is less than 5 years. So we're not talking about, you know, forever. And the worst thing is, Anisel Keys was a it ordinarily comes out as co-conspirator, but he was a co-principal author on this study. So he must have known this in 1973. And nobody published it. It took another, 43 years for us to find out about this. We've been led up the garden path for most of my life, so that's just a curve of what they found. And extraordinarily, last year, the American Heart Association was still pumping out this stuff. They say somewhere in this it says, we conclude strongly that lowering intake of saturated fat and replacing it with unsaturated fats, especially polyunsaturated, will lower the incidence of cardiovascular disease. Well, if you look at it, this meta-analysis is at the core of this paper. And what did they have to base this data on? They had 4 studies, 50 years, and they've got 4 blooming studies, right? All of which were done in the 1960s or 70s, and which involved, if you add those numbers there up, in the next to a Dayton 117 and so forth, there were 719 subjects in these studies. That's ludicrous. So let's jump forward to a couple of years ago. A guy called Tim Noakes was a professor of sports medicine in Cape Town. And he was an ultramarathon runner. And he was always sort of writing stuff saying, hey, you guys, you got to carb load for 3 days before your marathon and so forth, yeah? And well, all of a sudden, and he was practicing what he preached, obviously. All of a sudden, he'd got diabetes. So he was completely shocked, and he went back and he completely reevaluated everything that he thought he understood about fats and carbohydrates and so on and so forth. And he came to the conclusion that what was needed was a button that works. What was needed was a low carbohydrate, high fat diet, right? In fact, he said this, and this paper was only last year, but the available evidence from clinical and preclinical studies indicate that low-carb, high-fat diets consistently improve all other markers of cardiovascular risk, all other than cholesterol, and we know that actually cholesterol isn't a marker for cardiovascular disease, so it doesn't matter. So various people, particularly the Dietetic Association of South Africa, took exception to this, and they complained about him to the South African equivalent of the General Medical Council here. It's the Health Professions Council or something like that. And so he had a trial that went on. They reconvened several times at long month intervals. So it went on for about 18 months until I think it was April this year, when finally he was cleared of all the charges against him. Not before, mind you, the Health Professions Council had accidentally released the press release that they'd obviously already got written, saying that he'd been found guilty of all the charges. But he wasn't. So, you know, truth can out sometimes. Should also add that a high-fat diet is the best thing, for a low-carb, high-fat diet is the best thing available for weight loss, particularly for overweight, pre-diabetic type people. In this study, 1,000-calorie diets. The first one is 90% carbs, and you actually gain a bit of weight. This is per day, mind you, and the upper left is in pounds. So on high carb, 1,000-calorie diet, you'll gain a quarter of a pound a day. On a 90% protein diet, 1,000 calories, you'll lose just over half a pound. And on 90% fats, you'll lose nearly a whole pound. Now, I didn't have time to put a slide in about the other important area of fat's essentiality is, well, the two areas are the immune system and the nervous system. And it comes to the extent that these days any psychological disorder, and in course neurodegenerative disorders, any disorder of the nervous system, first clinical assumption has to be that the people are fat deficient. Of all the fats, the unsaturated, the saturated, and the cholesterol. And in fact, the statistics show that if you're low on cholesterol, well, if you're over the age of 50, you'll die sooner with a low cholesterol than with a high cholesterol. You won't die of heart disease. You'll die of two clusters of things. Number one, of cancers and infections. So that speaks of an immune system that's deficient in fats, because if ever when you want to make a cell, you've obviously got to get that 20% of lipids in there. And the immune system is the one that produces loads and loads of cells in a hurry to fight an infection or whatever. So if you can't produce the cells, you can't get over the cancer or the infection. And the second cluster of things that you die of with a low cholesterol is psychological. And it's interesting. You die of accidents, suicides, and violent deaths. So, I mean, that's just because your nervous system isn't working well. So, if you want to get to 100, eat loads of fat, and you've got a fantastic opportunity on this island. You've got loads of seafood. Listen, to all you people visiting here, don't go away without tasting the chanker crab. It's wonderful. The other thing you've got is this one. This is the reason I keep coming back to Guernsey. Thank you very much, folks.